information you want, truth you demand. This is the Brian Kilmeade Show.
Please don't politicize this virus. It exploits the differences you have at the national level. If you want to be exploited, and if you want to have many more body bags, then you do it. If you don't want many more body bags, then you refrain from politicizing it.
Well, that sounded like a threat to me. That is the head of the WHO, Ethiopian descent, where 60% of the Ethiopian economy is fueled by China. And this guy who will not acknowledge the existence of Taiwan or the success in crushing the virus, and gave China a pass. In fact, praised them handling this deadly virus that's in over 180 countries. That is the head of the WHO warning us not to politicize that. Do you believe this? Joining us now is Senator Tom Cotton, who probably does believe this. Senator, do you take that as a threat?
Yeah, Brian, I don't see how you could view what Dr. Tedros said as anything other than a threat. I think part of that is designed to deflect attention away from the WHO's obvious negligence in accepting what China has to say at face value, and in many cases in January, repeating Chinese propaganda that minimized the threat of the virus, such as saying that it wasn't transmissible from human to humans, when we already had evidence, as I was pointing out in January, that it most likely was. I think that's why it's important that we get to the bottom of exactly why China has so much influence with Dr. Tedros and WHO when we give almost 10 times as much money to the WHO as they do. As you pointed out, Ethiopia, when he was a minister there, was one of the very first countries to go in with the Belt and Road Initiative, and there's pretty well-established, well-deserved reputation for corruption touching on the Belt and Road Initiative with national leaders like Dr. Tedros. So it's important that we get to the bottom of exactly why he has always acted as an apologist for the Chinese Communist Party.
So, Senator, I'm going to go through a timeline here, and tell me when you became aware how bad this potentially could be. The WHO was wrong about the COVID-19 from the start. Let's go to Taiwan. Warned on December 31st that this virus was contagious. 2 weeks later, China was punishing doctors and destroying virus samples. WHO tweeted this, the Chinese line that there was no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission. And it wasn't until March 11th, after the virus had taken hold around the world, that WHO declared it a pandemic. Where were you on this?
You know, Brian, it was probably the second weekend in January that I first started following the news about the virus in China. At that point, it was still mostly East Asian news sources or obscure medical journals. But it was probably by mid-January that I sent my first letter to the administration and first started speaking about the virus to colleagues in the Senate and in the media. And even from those days, it was pretty clear that the virus had not originated in that food market. It was transmissible from humans to humans, and that the contagion rate would probably be much higher than, say, the seasonal flu. And unfortunately, the mortality rate was probably much higher as well. Yet, as you pointed out there, the WHO continued to basically parrot Chinese Communist Party talking points, or to have celebratory press conferences to, reveal that they had given it a name that was not insensitive to Chinese leaders' feelings. Totally misplaced priorities at the time. They should have declared a public health emergency almost immediately upon hearing about this from Beijing on December 31, and they should have moved much more aggressively to try to contain it within China at that point.
Right. So our intelligence, there's this big story about in December, our intelligence picked it up. In January, it was in the president's daily brief, how lethal this could be. What is the reality here? Because you took your concern right to the White House. We're in the middle of the impeachment mess. So what could you tell me about how aware they were of this when you brought it to them?
So, Brian, I can tell you this. I mean, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, took the extraordinary step a couple of days ago of putting out a statement disputing, I think it was an ABC News report, maybe one that was subsequently picked up by CNN, that there was some kind of classified intelligence briefing as far back as November, December, about the risk of this virus. I can tell you that, again, all the information I had through January really was coming from publicly available sources. Again, not on the routine daily reading list of most Americans, but, as a senator who tries to follow these news stories and stay ahead of them, news that was brought to my attention from East Asian news sources or medical journals or so forth. So when I first spoke to senior administration officials, to include the president and the vice president, the coronavirus task force was already up and running. It wasn't doing daily briefings, so it probably wasn't front of mind for most Americans, but it was up and running and trying to assess just how serious this virus would ultimately prove. And as Dr. Birx has said, Chinese lies about the virus in December and January really did minimize a lot of the best thinking in the Western world, in Europe and in the United States, about how to approach this virus. But going as early as mid-January, when I first spoke with the president and the vice president about it, the coronavirus task force is already up and running.
Wow. So, Senator, now where we are, they look at you and Liz Cheney as two people that stood out early and said this could be cataclysmic, and it turned out to be just that. So I am not interested in looking back. Let's look forward. We're in the middle of this shutdown. We're watching lives and livelihoods come crashing into a brick wall, but we're told we have no choice. In your state, they decided not to stand in place. They have restrictions, but that's not what the governor wants to do. Have we as a country overreacted, or are we making the right reaction?
No, Brian, I wouldn't say that we've overreacted, and I wouldn't put too much stock in the headline story coming out of governor's action. So, for instance, Governor Hutchinson may not have something called a stay-at-home order in place, but if you get into details of what's happening in Arkansas, it's not much different, in some cases more restrictive than what you see in other states. You can't get a haircut in Arkansas the way you can in some states. Washington State, as the governor has pointed out, has marijuana dispensaries that are still open. But the schools are closed at the end of the year in Arkansas. Places like barbershops, restaurants, bars, movie theaters, gyms, they're all closed as well. Just last weekend, the governor closed lodging at our parks and in their vicinity to non-Arkansans and so forth. So we're taking the same steps that so many others are taking around the country and really around the Western world. As we begin, hopefully, to get past the worst of this, as you see the case trend lines start to trend downward, even in places like New York City, we're still going to see deaths tragically continue to increase for several more days because those lag case testing. But as we see those trend lines bend downward, hopefully we can begin to gradually, in certain regions of the country, in certain kinds of businesses that have lower density presence of people, for the population segments that are least vulnerable, begin on a gradual, rolling, calibrated basis to get the economy back on its feet. So we'll really be interested in what's happening in some countries that have had the earliest outbreaks and the most aggressive responses, who are now starting down that path 2 or 3 weeks ahead of us, like Austria is just opening up small stores. Denmark is doing something similar. But we also want to avoid what you see in Singapore, which sadly had a very effective response in March. But just in the last 4 or 5 days, they've seen record number of cases there as the virus has resurged. So we've got to balance. We've got to balance getting the economy back on its feet without having the virus return and surge back in places, because that, of course, will just lead the economy to stumble again, even as it's getting back on its feet. And ultimately what matters most, Brian, it's not what the president says on this, because the president didn't shut anything down. He doesn't have that power in our system. Even the governors and mayors who do have that power were largely reacting to what public perception already was. So the way we get our economy back on its feet and get people back to work is not through a government decree. It is through giving our people the confidence that the spread of the virus has been arrested. They're less likely to get it if they get back into their normal routines. And if they do get it, our healthcare system will be effective and functioning to help them recover.
Right. In Arkansas, do you have more people come up to you saying, I'm glad there are restrictions, or more saying, hey, let me open up again, let me get going?
Vastly more in the first case. Vastly more, Brian. Arkansans, like most Americans, are taking this very seriously. And again, that's why I say that if you were to just have a government decree to open things back up, it really wouldn't be effective. Because if you look back to early and mid-March, many of the governors and mayors who issued the first stay-at-home orders were simply responding to what public perception already was on a voluntary and spontaneous basis. Or just look at the data. You can go back and look at open table bookings for restaurants in early March, or look at the fact that before movie theaters were shut down, movie ticket sales across the nation were basically zero for an entire weekend, something that is unprecedented. So as important as government policy can be, even more important is that policy give our people the confidence they need to get back into their normal routines. Without that change in public perception and public confidence, we're not going to see people getting back to work and getting back to their normal economic routines.
So antibody testing, we have to also get the quick rapid test, make it the rapid test. We also have to get close to a therapy. And my goodness, got to zero in on a vaccine by the end of the summer, at least. So it's got to be a series of things. But I just think there's a way to do it incrementally that we wouldn't have to watch this slow-moving car wreck that we're watching now.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. There's no single magic bullet that's going to solve this. All of those things you cited are important. Getting tests scaled up even more than they are now, which is very rapid, but to the point where we can be testing at, say, workplaces if someone demonstrates a fever coming in. Getting antibody tests out so we can see and identify people who had the virus without symptoms. Getting personal protective equipment like masks scaled up so much that not even our doctors and nurses have plenty of it, but workers at the workplace have plenty of it. Getting our state and local governments, the training and the personnel they need to quickly identify cases and isolate them and then trace their contacts so we can move from a population-wide measure that we have now into individual case-based measures that we want in the future. Those are the kind of steps that are going to have to be taken as we move ahead to gradually get people out of their homes, back to their workplace, back into shops and restaurants and stores and so forth.
And lastly, Senator, how do you keep him busy? What are you doing?
Well, twofold. One, I'm on the phone a ton. If it's not talking to people like you, it's talking to administration officials on things like the rebate checks are going to be going out next week, or the small business lending program that got kicked off last week, or talking to my colleagues in the Senate about future legislation or expertise. And then two, it's working with the little guys that you may hear running around behind me, getting them set up with Legos so they won't interrupt my radio interviews.
I understand, but I understand if you had to be interrupted too, especially in this time with everyone doing their home studios, because Senator Mitch McConnell tried to do something logical. Hey, that small business loan? We need more money. We're going to go just slot out $350 billion and put $600 billion in, and Democrats stopped it. Will there be a revisit on that? Do you understand? Have you talked to leadership? Because we're going to run out of money soon.
I hope so. Right now, the Senate is slated to have one of its brief so-called pro forma sessions where it just gavels into session for about 30 seconds. But business can be done. And the issue that Senator McConnell pointed out, which is true, is that the small business lending program is so popular, it could run out of money in the next 10 days or so. All of the other vital programs that we passed last month, like support for hospitals and clinics, could one day run out of money, but right now we don't see that in the near-term future. So why don't we give money to the program that need it most, and we can have debate about the other programs as they become more needful.
Senator Tom Cotton, back to parenting. Good luck.
Amen. Thank you, Brian.
You got it. Senator Tom Cotton, who was there, was one of the first in America to say we got a huge problem coming out of China. Man, was he right.